this is the sheep brain. We are going to go over some of the major parts on the sheep brain. So you can see from the size and also the way it is shaped, it's more kind of oblong. It has a long end in the front, and you can see the cerebellum in the back. This is the entire sheep brain. This is the superior view. This is the inferior view. This one is having the covering, which is the dura mater on the outside. We call meninges in general. Dura mater is the thick fibrous connective tissue layer you see outside, but there are three meninges in the brain which make the covering. The outside is the dura mater. Then you have an inner layer. It's very thin, like looks like a spider web. It's even hard to see. That's your arachnoid matter. And then the next layer on the brain itself is the pia mater. So you have dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. The pia mater is the surface of the brain, and they have spaces between these three layers depending on whether it's above or below. You call it epi or sub, like epidural space, subdural space, subarachnoid space. So for example, the subarachnoid space is below the arachnoid matter and the pia mater. That's where you'll have cerebrospinal fluid lubricating the brain. Okay, so that's for the meninges of the brain, and we will first do the superior view. Okay, if you take the brain in your hand, so you can, first of all, you need to figure out whether it's my front or back of the brain, whether it's my right or left half of the brain. So how can you do that? The first key or the first hint or the landmark is your cerebellum. Looks like a little brain. Okay, this is all your cerebrum. Cerebrum makes the most of your brain. Okay, cerebellum is in the back. So that tells you this is the anterior portion, this is the posterior portion of the brain. And so because you know that now, you can know that that's your right and the left. Because always you have to be specific whether it's right or left if you have two parts on both sides. So you have to tell whether it's my right or left, and so on and so forth. Okay, so first of all, if you see, the brain has two halves. This is your right hemisphere, that's your left hemisphere, which are separated in the middle by this deep groove, which is your longitudinal fissure. Okay, longitudinal fissure separates the two halves of the brain. Then if you see on the surface of the brain, most of your brain is your cerebrum. Okay, name the whole entire structure, that's your cerebrum on both the hemispheres. But if you see, you have some raised areas which are the elevated areas or the elevations we call gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S, gyri plural, G-Y-R-I. And then you see these grooves. Each groove is going to be called sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. The plural will be S-U-L-C-I. So sulcus is singular. Okay, so that's for the gyrus and sulcus, all the raised areas and the grooves. Can you see that? Okay. Then we divide the brain into 5 lobes. In general, we divide the brain into forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain in the back. But we also divide into various lobes. In the front, you can recall your bones: frontal bone, occipital bone, parietal, temporal bone. So likewise, we have all this region in the front is the frontal lobe, and then here is your parietal lobe on the top, and on the side that's your temporal lobe, and the back that's your occipital lobe. Okay, so be careful. Okay, if the pin is here, it's your parietal, frontal, occipital, and temporal lobe. There's one more lobe, they call it insula. You cannot see, it's deeper to the temporal lobe, I-N-S-U-L-A, insula. Okay. Then if you see the next figure, the very first figure in your lab book, okay, if you pull the cerebrum and the cerebellum apart, You see, it looks like somebody sitting on a toilet seat. Sorry about that, but it looks like that, right? You see 4 structures that make up this whole thing. The whole structure is called corpora quadrigemina. Okay, quadri means 4, right? Quadriceps, quadrigemina, corpora quadrigemina. And the top 2 are your superior colliculi. The bottom 2 are inferior colliculi. The singular is colliculus, C-O-L-L-I-C-U-L-U-S. So depending on which one is being pinned, okay, can you guys see that, what I'm showing them? Okay, so depending on what is being pinned, if I am touching this, if you have to be specific, I'm touching the one here. So what would you call that?
Right superior.
Right superior colliculus. Correct. Left superior colliculus. Right inferior colliculus. Left inferior colliculus. Always learn the singular word, because mostly we will be asking name this part, not name these parts. So singular is better. Plural is good to know. Okay, then if you turn over the page, you can see the inferior view of the brain. Okay, so now you can see the inferior view of the brain, and look between these two. Okay, something is missing here, right? You see this bump here? This is your pituitary gland. It's attached to the inferior side of the brain by a little tiny stalk. It looks like a straw, very small, and they call that gland pituitary gland. Okay, you will see it in another picture. The word will be in another page. This is your pituitary gland. Okay, so how it is hanging? So imagine this is my pituitary gland, this is the stalk, so it will be hanging like this. Okay, so in your book you will see a word called infundibulum referring to this hole, but that's the continuation of the stalk of the pituitary gland. It's like a straw. Imagine a straw. So that's your infundibulum, but we will point to this hole as infundibulum because if your pituitary gland breaks off, you won't see that. Okay, so you see the difference, right? That's an important thing to make a note. So now you can match the picture in your book with this view. So what do we have? You see 2 projections here up in the front. This is the inferior view of the brain. These are your olfactory nerves, but the projection here they call olfactory bulb. Can you see that? Can you match with your picture in the book, please? The path of the nerve they call olfactory tract. Can we see that, everybody? Okay. Then when you come here, you have 2 nerves that you can see it better in this one, in this model. I may use this model. So you can see here, these are the optic nerves coming from the eyes. This is the brain, your eyes are here, okay, in the front. So these are the optic nerves coming. So the nerve is optic nerve. The path of the nerve they call optic tract. And the crossover point where you see this pin, can you see that it makes like a X, right? The crossover point they call optic chiasma. Then you can see the hole here that represents the infundibulum, the stalk of the pituitary gland that connects the pituitary gland to the brain. And right below the infundibulum, if you see, if I can remove this pin, I'm going to remove this too. See, you can see this little round area right below the hole. That's your mammillary body. So this is where, if it helps, if you have the key in front, that key has all these numbers. I had emailed you to print, or you can do it later. Okay. Then if you see the lower portion of the brain, here you have the spinal cord at the very tip. This is the stem of the brain, the medulla oblongata, and this is the pons where you see the next bump. So you can see one bump, another bump, right? The first one is your medulla oblongata, then you have the pons, and above that we have what we call cerebral peduncle. Okay, so these are the structures you can see from the inferior view of the brain. You can still see the frontal, temporal, occipital lobes in this view as well. Okay, so that was your pituitary gland, just to remind you. So basically, if you don't see the hole, that means you have the pituitary gland covering and hiding that hole. That's a hint. Okay, now we can look at some more structures. If you take the next figure, figure 4 in your book, you can see the sagittal view or mid-sagittal view. So if you take the brain and pass a knife right across through the longitudinal fissure, through the cerebellum, then you'll get this half. So let's see the structures. You can use that figure if you like. Either you can use the sheep or human brain, it's all the same. So for the most part, what is obvious here, again you can see the most of your brain is your cerebrum, right? And here you have your cerebellum, right? And then if you see in the middle of the brain you have this C-shaped structure. It looks like a letter C going all the way from here to here, right? Comes around. Can you all see that? Or find a position where you can see my hand and the brain. Please come behind me. Or okay, I'm trying to show everybody as clearly as possible. So this is your corpus callosum. Okay, so they call this region fornix, but let's call this upper portion where it looks like a letter C the corpus callosum. And if I pass this needle inside, can you see a space? And can you see a space where I'm passing the needle around? And see it's continuing? And it ends up here in this space, right? So these are all spaces that have cerebral spinal fluid for the passage of the fluid. We call these ventricles. So there are different ventricles. There are a couple of lateral ventricles, one on the right, one on the left. So these are your lateral ventricles. This is my right or left? Right half of the brain, right? So this is your right lateral ventricle. Okay, there's one on the other half. Okay, and this is going to be called your third ventricle. See, it's so thin and narrow, but I can pass the needle around. Can you see that? And then this is going to be your fourth ventricle, that's between the medulla and the cerebellum. And you can see a little wedge, a V-shaped wedge. Okay, and connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle is a passage. We call that cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so what is happening basically, the cerebrospinal fluid forms in your lateral ventricle. There are structures they call choroid plexus which are found within this that make the cerebrospinal fluid. There are cells that secrete them, and then the fluid comes out to the third ventricle. It flows through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, then it goes further down and gets into this subarachnoid space that's between the arachnoid space and the arachnoid matter and the pia matter, subarachnoid space. Okay, is everybody okay with that? There's a picture in your book in another page that shows the pathway of the CSF. If you turn around under the meninges, you will see that. What page do we have, Esther?
194.
194. Yeah. So if you want, you can take a look. Then we are going to do more structures in the midbrain. So this round area right in the middle of the brain, can you all see? It's round or oval depending on the brain. You will see that. It's very obvious. That's your thalamus. Then if you see a word intermediate mass, that's the center part of the thalamus. In the models you can see Can you see the model here? You see this little dot? That's your intermediate mass. That's where the